we want to tell you about another podcast from PRX called Monumental. This podcast explores questions about the past, present, and future of U.S. monuments, uncovering the stories about what and who is important, as well as the stories that have been left out. Join host Ashley Seaford across the country with their team of journalists. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, September 19th, 1796, a letter from George Washington appears in the Philadelphia Daily American Advertiser, a popular newspaper, and its headline is The Address of General Washington to the People of America on His Declining the Presidency of the United States. And it did just that. This was the first president of the United States, probably the most lauded of the founding fathers, who had steered the country into independence, was now saying that his time was done, voluntarily saying so. It is one of the most famous speeches in American history, except, as we are about to discuss, it wasn't ever really a speech. It was just a letter in a newspaper. But nonetheless, Washington's words really are remarkable, as was his decision to not run again. And of course, they feel particularly relevant as we are in the wake of Joe Biden declining to run again, a move that many at the time compared to this George Washington moment. So let's talk about George Washington's farewell remarks, his declining to run again, the sort of interesting positioning that he takes in this letter. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I think we can add this to a sort of minor side list of Mandela effect moments where I think people have this notion of like George Washington getting up there and giving this teary-eyed speech where he says, I've done everything I can for this country, and now it's time for me to go into the sunset years or whatever. And instead, it's a letter to a newspaper saying, I'm not going to run for president again. So maybe a little less. I don't know. Does that diminish anything for either of you?
I mean, most famous letter to the editor in American history.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
I like a good letter.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, it's been dramatized as a speech in plays like Hamilton. And so you get this, and it's called an address. And I think that when we think about an address, we think about remarks being delivered. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. But I do think that by remembering that it was just a letter printed in the newspaper, it reminds us a little bit of the slower scale of things back then. And also like the fact that the president was less of a daily figure who you constantly saw and you constantly heard from, right? This is pretty much the way that presidents communicate. It's how they did State of the Unions. It's all in writing, and the president is less of a in-your-face figure on a regular basis.
Absolutely. It's not really until the 20th century that you get like fireside chats and State of the Unions and televised. I mean, there's the kind of fanfare that we would think would be there is not necessarily there. Now, I think obviously when the letter is decimated throughout all of the newspapers, it starts a buzz and people are talking and thinking about this, but certainly not in the same way that we do today.
Yeah, and people do start to read it out loud. I think that's generally how stuff was disseminated, right? It'd go into a newspaper, people would then read it out loud, and so it becomes a sort of oral address. That said, and we can jump ahead and compare this to maybe it's the most famous address in American history, I think, until the Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address, right, like is very short, very clearly meant to be delivered in real time. There's part of me that's kind of happy that Washington didn't actually try and deliver this out loud. I mean, stuff like, I beg you at the same time to do me the justice to be assured that this resolution has not been taken without a strict regard to all the considerations appertaining to the relation which binds a dutiful citizen to his country. That's the first third of that sentence. I mean, it's like,
It's not.
Take a breath, George.
Take a breath, George.
I know.
People had a lot more time back then to sort of sit and read and reread and sentence diagram everything. So
periods were really expensive, so it was hard to end a sentence.
So, I understand why it showed up in a newspaper. But yeah, it is not. We'll talk about how actually this does get read a lot. But it is not a piece of oratory. It is a letter. And, whether that is a distinction without a difference, I think it is really interesting. And I agree that word address kind of confuses people. But there is also very soaring, resonant and famous language in this. So what is actually in this address that isn't an address?
I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting is that he's not like saying goodbye to the nation. I think when we think of a farewell address, we think someone's going off into the sunset, you know, like in that sort of their retirement. It's more like, hey guys, I'm not running this election. So just so you know, like this is it for me. And I think it was a way of him trying to prepare the nation to think of other leaders, prepare the nation to say like, hey, we've got a little bit of time. Just so you know, I'm not going to be on the ballot. And I'm choosing not to be on the ballot. I'm not being pushed out. I'm not being persuaded. This is not some sort of hostile takeover. And I think it was a way, really, and this is why it's been hailed as so like presidential, like this is what leadership should look like. The passing of the baton. Like, okay, I've run my leg. Now it's the next person's turn. How do I set them up for success? How do I prepare the nation not to think of me as a king or a monarch? Because for so many, that's all people knew was monarchs that lived until they died and their sons took over.
Neither a farewell nor an address. Discuss. Yeah. So it's not quite a farewell, but it is. I mean, it is this most monumental act of his presidency, which is his declaration that he's willingly going to leave power. But in a way, if it's not quite a farewell, it is sort of a summation of lessons learned and warnings to the future. Because one of the big things that happens during Washington's 2 terms is that very quickly political parties arise. He doesn't formally enter a party, but there are political parties, there are factions, and 8 years earlier they were like, that will never happen. And of course it immediately does. And so he warns against faction and parties. He gives his very Obama-esque, there are no red states, there are no blue states.
Yeah.
We fought for a common cause and we are a common people. And then he does also, in part of his arguments against parties, also warns against getting involved in foreign entanglements. Because one of the things that really divided the Federalists from the Republicans was whether they supported Britain or whether they supported France. And if you're going to get tied up in all of those foreign relations, those divisions are going to continue to split the country, but also this very fragile independence that the United States had would be at risk as well. So he's issuing these warnings about how to safeguard, again, this like very new experimental government. And that's kind of the warning that he sends out in the farewell address.
It's pretty clear to everyone by now that social media has changed everything from the way we live to how we discuss politics and what we think we know about the world around us. Which begs the question, who's in charge here? Hi, I'm John Favreau, former Obama speechwriter turned chronically online host of Offline with John Favreau. Join me every week just outside your social media-fueled echo chamber for a smarter, lighter conversation about the real-time changes and real-world effects of social media and the internet on all of our lives. Check out Offline with John Favreau every Sunday wherever you get your podcasts.
In the lead up to the 2024 U.S. elections, more people than ever are wondering how our electoral process actually works. What systems are in place to ensure secure and accurate results? And how can we recognize misinformation and be able to fully participate in our democracy? The new season of Democracy Decoded, a podcast by Campaign Legal Center, covers all of this. You'll learn from top lawyers and democracy's frontline heroes, such as poll workers and civil rights advocates, to understand how our elections function, the potential threats they face, and the checks and balances in place so voters can rest assured that the election results will reflect the will of the people. Because here's the thing, our electoral system works, and Democracy Decoded will help you understand why. Listen now at democracydecoded.org. That's democracydecoded.org, or on your favorite podcast app. And big thanks to Democracy Decoded for sponsoring the show. On the sort of rhetoric and the positioning of this, so a couple things you just mentioned are worth highlighting. One, this is the end of Washington's second term. He had considered retiring at the end of his first term. He's very popular, but there are starting to be cracks of kind of people souring on Washington. And so I think there's a sort of reading of the situation that, like, I'm at the peak of my both power and esteem here. And if I were to say run and then lose and then write an address, like, no one wants to hear that, right? But in this moment, taking this selfless act, imparting these words, it will land in a way that we see that it clearly does. So I think it's a really sort of smart understanding there, which obviously resonant a little bit to Joe Biden, which we'll talk about. And then, this warning, both about foreign entanglements and then about this kind of look at how far we've come. And he says, we have a common cause. We fought and we triumphed together. And there are, quote, designing men thirsty for power who will try and create distrust among the country's different regions. Be on guard because, quote, your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty. So, I don't know. This may be obvious, but saying that in the wake of like losing, right, or some other, is not as powerful as saying it, willingly and taking this step. That said, I'm struck a little bit by the reaction in real time. I mean, Washington has his critics at the time, and William Duane called Washington's letter, quote, the loathings of a sick mind.
Yeah. Not remembered that way today.
Really Tell me how you really feel.
Well, Duane is now remembered as half of a second-rate pharmacy chain, so,
oh, how the mighty have fallen.
Exactly. And then James Madison is writing to James Monroe, and he says basically like Washington's mixing up with the French here. There's all sorts of suspicion of French involvement in this. And so, I think there is a kind of sense that he was outliving his welcome.
James Madison sees him as being a partisan in this speech. He's saying, he's just trying to poison the well against those of us who support France in the French Revolution. Like, this isn't a genuine apolitical speech. This is him looking out for the Federalists. And so it is not only today where these decisions are looked at through just like a deeply set of partisan suspicions.
But it's interesting because Washington also wanted to step down after his first term and decided not to because he was like, it's too divisive out there.
Not going to go well.
I don't know if I can trust Jefferson and all these other people. They will tear this country apart before we can hit year 10. So, he does do that second term to sort of really, I think, allow leaders to get their stuff together so that the country can be a little bit on stronger footing before it makes this big transition into a new leader.
We should say one more thing about the timing, which is, when Joe Biden dropped out, it was July, and that led to a very compressed election. In this case, George Washington is stepping down in September. And the reason that is possible, and the reason why that doesn't create widespread panic, is because this is a period of time in which the electors genuinely just go and chat about who's going to be the next president. It's a small group of men. They are able to say, okay, well, we're not voting for Washington. Time to start thinking about who's next. So there isn't this enormous campaign and election infrastructure. There aren't, masses of people casting their ballots. It really is just the small group of people who are going to deliberate and determine who the next president is going to be.
But that fact, I think, further underscores sort of the power of putting this in a newspaper, right? Because he could have, the pro forma thing would have been to just alert Congress, right? Or just talk to that small group that is going to sort of really have to deal with this. But instead, he goes to the people through newspaper, through mass communication. And so I think there is power in that. All right. This speech, I think, very quickly becomes very famous. Do we have thoughts about kind of its fame, its legacy, how it enters the public imagination, its interpretation, misinterpretation?
So one of the misinterpretations I think we saw a lot over the past month or so in discussions about Biden, there were political calculations that were built into the timing of the speech and the content of the speech. It was not just this expression of pure selflessness from the most disinterested president that we've ever had. So I think bringing back in the politics to the farewell address is worth doing. And then as far as its legacy, I feel like that foreign entanglements line gets quoted all the time in any sort of class or discussion of U.S. foreign policy. That's certainly one of its lasting legacies.
I would feel like, for me, it's the fact that he sort of brought it to the people. He could have done these backroom dealings easily and said, all right, here's what we're going to do. It's going to go like this. But the fact that I think he wrote it for the public to consume and sort of almost create like a layer of accountability, so to speak, to where it's where they can be like, well, Washington said, like this is what he wants. It's almost like not like a last will and testament, but kind of sort of, I think the people will hold accountable those who live up to the wishes of Washington.
Yeah. This address is read still to this day every year in Congress or in the Senate as on Washington's birthday, and they alternate parties. So one Democrat, one Republican reads Washington's farewell address, and it gets name checked all the time as a putting country over party or over self moment. And the comparisons to Biden were very explicit, this summer. And I think it's largely scans. I mean, I think, from a kind of power of the impact of the words, Biden, I think, kind of was a few weeks too late, right? It felt like his hand was forced in a way that if he had maybe just sort of really felt like it was purely selfless. But nevertheless, I think, I find Biden's decision to not run very kind of selfless and moving and thought-provoking along many of these same lines.
Why don't we talk about, well, I kind of know the answer to this, but why don't we talk about Johnson in the same way? Yeah. Because Johnson also says, I'm not going to run again.
Right.
Now, part of that's because he's so hated, but no one is like, wow, that's so brave, Johnson.
I think it's because Johnson was facing a competitive primary and could have lost the nomination. In this case, Biden had the nomination. The only person who could have taken that nomination away from him was himself. So it really was all on him to make the decision.
Yeah, it felt like pure political calculus. And, I also think it's just a mark of the particular era. Though, I mean, this is a very divisive era, and I think a lot of people on the right still probably would dismiss Biden's move as political calculus or whatever. But actually, again, that's why I think it's like kind of remarkable that it kind of broke through how divisive this moment is, and felt a little bit like everyone recognized a sense of selflessness there in Biden's move. It's kind of remarkable. By the by, this is a sort of aside, but I think it doesn't get codified for a while, but Washington sort of inadvertently sets the sort of 2-term precedent here by doing this, by stepping down at the end of the second term. Obviously, future presidents don't abide by that, but it is interesting that if he had just decided to do it after 1, then maybe the norm would have been 1 term, or if he decided to do it after 3, the norm would have been 3. So,
I can't imagine an election every year. Like,
yeah. All right. Anything else you want to say about this speech? It is in Hamilton.
And Bill Clinton invokes it in the DNC.
Yeah, he talked about it.
Convention. Yeah.
So we'll see if it continues to. When is Washington? When is Washington's birthday? This
February.
President's Day is in February. Lincoln and Washington and Frederick Douglass.
So,
a little bit.
Washington's your next chance to hear this is Washington's next birthday, February 17th, which is a Monday in 2025. So you will hear. I don't know if it's a Republican or a Democrat who's up to read it. I don't know if any of those things will exist in February 2025. We shall see.
Will we have a Senate? Who knows?
I know. Stay tuned.
What a few months we have ahead of us here. All right. Well, let's leave it there at the end of this episode. Thank you, Nicole Hemmer, as always.
Farewell, Jody.
All right. And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.